This is another lecture for Section 2. This is going to be about the Cold War. The Cold War was a period of geopolitical tension characterized by ideological conflict, proxy wars, and an arms race, but without direct, large-scale military conflict between the two countries, that being the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, proxy war is a conflict in which major powers support opposing sides without directly engaging into combat. When we talk about the concept of a hydrogen bomb or a thermonuclear weapon, they are the types of nuclear weapons that derive their explosive power from nuclear fusion rather than nuclear fission. In relation with this, using fusion in coordination with a fission process, we find that this allows for far greater explosive yields, potentially thousands of times more potent than the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. Now, when we talk about civil liberties, we are looking at the fundamental rights and freedoms intended to protect individuals from government power. In the United States, these include the freedom of speech, religion, and assembly, as listed in the American Bill of Rights and its other amendments. A blacklist is a large list of people or things that are regarded as unacceptable or untrustworthy and should be excluded or avoided. The shotgun wedding between the United States and the Soviet Union quickly fell apart at the war's end. The long-held mistrust between the two countries, rooted in their conflicting worldviews, could no longer be suppressed. The previous agreements collapsed as Stalin sought to dominate the Eastern European countries through intimidation and military conquest. This competition was reflected in the former Allies' drive to gain an advantage through the capture of German scientists and their creations. The American Operation Paperclip, which sent scientists and specialists into Germany, played a significant role in the country's advancements, despite the fact that it allowed many Nazi criminals to avoid punishment for their crimes. At first, Harry S. Truman remained cautious in his dealings with the USSR, recognizing the country's fears and anger towards a history of constant invasion and intimidation. Though Truman sought to establish international balances in the world, his plans collapsed when the USSR intervened in the post-war Greek unrest. With the fall of Germany, the Big Three divided Germany into four occupied zones under the control of France, Britain, Germany, and the Soviet Union. These zones created two sections of Germany, which included the Soviet sector and the new Allied sector, taking into account that the Soviet Union was no longer seen as a member of the alliance. The German city of Berlin, located in the Soviet zone, was also divided into four sectors along the same lines as the country as a whole. Initially, these agreements between the countries permitted open travel throughout Germany and throughout Berlin without any territorial restrictions. But what we're going to find is that gradually this will disappear. Between 1944 and 1945, a new international organization was created to mediate disputes between its members and impede, in their hopes of impeding, future aggression. The United Nations represented a modified version of the former League of Nations that was established after World War I. The US, Russia, France, Britain, and China all served as permanent members of the Security Council, with each of these countries maintaining the power to issue an absolute veto against proposed actions of the UN. Unfortunately, this created a serious obstacle to the UN's success as it pitted two ideological opponents against each other, giving them the power to undermine the system as a whole. Despite these obstacles, we need to keep in mind that the United Nations has achieved significant success with its humanitarian programs, which have constantly garnered support from the United States, the Soviet Union, and later China. As the Soviet Union and its former allies grew further apart, Joseph Stalin isolated his country and its territorial possessions from Western influence and commercial trade. In March of 1946, Winston Churchill declared that a Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. As the USSR attempted to spread its influence throughout Europe, a new alliance formed against the Soviet Union, furthering the tension between the great powers. This tension is going to lead to the beginning of what we are calling the Cold War, which represented the political, military, and economic competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. And this is going to dominate world affairs from 1946 all the way to 1989, creating instability throughout the world. The Cold War was directly influenced by the fear of another world war, which discouraged the United States and the Soviet Union from engaging in direct conflict, especially in the early years, as the United States maintained its nuclear weapons advantage. We need to keep in mind that even though the United States did maintain an advantage through nuclear weapons, following in its century-old process after World War II, it had greatly reduced the capabilities of its military. The Soviets and numerous other countries followed suit as they could not afford to maintain their wartime militaries. However, as in the past, the U.S. reductions were seen by many as more drastic than those taking place in the USSR. And at its heart, the Cold War focused on gaining influence over less powerful nations through economic competition, diplomatic maneuvering, and indirect military engagements through proxy wars. Now, though both countries were rebuilding their nations after the war, we're going to find that the United States' alliance with France and England helped to maintain the advantage that the Western nations needed over the Soviet Union. When it came to the strategy of the United States and its allies, we're going to find that this strategy was based on their understanding of the new Soviet Union that was created through a report known as the Long Telegram. Now, the Long Telegram was inspired by the diplomat George Kennan, and this 8,000-word report stated that the Soviet fanaticism made cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union impossible. However, Kennan predicted that the USSR would collapse from within as communism and its economic model could not function for the long period. Unfortunately, though, he would point out that for the United States, until the USSR's collapse, the USSR would basically pose a threat to not only the United States, but all global stability, and would act as a thorn in the American side until its eventual collapse. In response to this report, by 1947, President Truman's advisors pushed for a policy of containment. Their new plan for the Soviets was to stop Stalin's expansion of the USSR in a manner that they hoped would avoid direct conflict. The post-Second World War Soviet Union had suffered massive losses despite its victory over Germany. The loss of millions of its citizens, the destruction of its cities, and the depletion of its treasury had left the country close to collapse. Turning down all offers of assistance, the USSR quickly rebuilt its economy, military, and agricultural base. But they did this, as they had done before during the war, on the backs of its people. They also cemented their control over countries that they occupied after World War II in order to establish themselves as the undeniable second world power of the period. Between 1945 and 1965, we'll find that the USSR equaled, if not at times surpassed, the United States scientifically and militarily, by often taking shortcuts and using haphazard engineering to create the illusion of technological superiority. Its ardent commitment to security allowed the USSR to maintain the illusion of greatness for decades by hiding its numerous failures while highlighting its new accomplishments. Throughout its history, one of the primary problems with the Soviet economy was the absence of incentives to promote innovations. Salary structures offered little reward for hard labor and extraordinary achievement. Without the promise of advancement, workers did only what was necessary while attempting to gather whatever resources were available for sale on the black market. Now, these problems of incentives also existed on the managerial level, as centralized planning discouraged innovative thoughts or innovative processes. An example could be seen in the factory managers who were assigned monthly and annual quotas by the Gosplan, or what is also their state plan. The success or failure in the Soviet system was based purely on quotas, not on the quality of their work, even if their products failed to work. As such, Soviet products, whether they be commercial or military, were not reliable as they were prone to failure. And we're going to find that this would play a major role in the Soviet space program's failure to thrive in the same way that NASA did. Although containment was considered only a temporary policy, it transformed into what became known as the Truman Doctrine. And this doctrine became the cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy until it was modified by President Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s. The Truman Doctrine perceived that the U.S. maintained the right and the responsibility to challenge the growth of communism, thus allowing the United States to take any action to support countries fighting against communism. As a result of the Truman Doctrine and the Cold War, the United States abandoned its long-standing commitment to isolationism, yet continued to maintain a scaled-down military. In early 1947, Russian attempts to gain influence in Greece through the support of a civil war inspired the president to take the case to the public and push for far more aggressive approaches to Stalin and the USSR by declaring it the new nemesis of the United States. To challenge the Soviet Union in its attempt to influence other countries, the United States will implement the Marshall Plan. Now, this plan was created by Secretary of State George C. Marshall in support of the Truman Doctrine. And the Marshall Plan sought to aid European countries devastated by the Second World War. The plan provided over $13 billion, which would be close to $170 billion in today's dollars, in economic assistance to Western European countries to rebuild their economies, infrastructures, and industries. The offer of support placed the United States as an alternative to the Soviet Union's attempts to gain influence through economic aid and to strengthen democratic institutions and reduce the appeal of communism. Now, this plan explicitly excluded the Soviet Union and any of its satellite states, and this solidified the division of Europe and thereby increasing tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. In its focus on the Soviet Union, the United States implemented the National Security Act, which was a three-part plan enacted in 1947 to counter the growing threat posed by possible communist influence within the United States. Now, first, it replaced the War Department with the Department of Defense. Then it established the National Security Council, or NSC, to administer and coordinate national defense agencies and the Department of State. The NSC was also supposed to serve as a coordinating agency, sifting through the increasing flow of diplomatic and intelligence information in order to provide the President and Congress with brief but detailed reports so that they could build upon those policies. Lastly, it established the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA. Now, this new agency was formed to gather intelligence regarding foreign military, political, and economic situations worldwide. In addition to these major accomplishments or creations, the act also emphasized civilian control over the military by establishing civilian secretaries for each branch of the armed forces and the Secretary of Defense. In the act, the Department of the United States Air Force was created as a separate military service, taking over the functions previously held by the Army Air Forces. It also implemented the formation of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which was created to advise the President on military strategy and planning. In 1948, Stalin responded to changing Western attitudes by closing the entire city of Berlin and the surrounding Soviet-controlled territory on June 24th in what became known as the Berlin Blockade. All ground routes in the Soviet zone were closed to Allied traffic, depriving the Western citizens of Berlin food, medical supplies, and other critical resources. Seeking not to defy Stalin and open the door to a Third World War, Truman ordered the constant resupply of the Allied zones in Berlin through a massive airlift maintained by the newly established U.S. Air Force and England's Royal Air Force. Truman warned that any attack upon Allied aircraft would be considered an act of war. Because of the success of the airlift in meeting the needs of the isolated sections of Berlin, by May of 1949, Stalin was unable to maintain the blockade and reopened critical land access points. This was seen as a victory for the United States and its allies, but we need to keep in mind that this will prove to be the last for an extended period of time, as this would be the only first of numerous confrontations between the Allies and the USSR. Recognizing the need to present a strong military deterrence to the Soviet armed incursions into Europe, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was formed in April of 1949. It consisted of 10 European nations, along with Canada and the United States. In 1960, NATO added West Germany, Greece, and Turkey as its members. The organization resembled the previously mentioned European pacts of the First World War and the Tripartite Pact with Germany, Italy, and Japan. Should any of the countries within NATO come under the attack of the USSR, the other members would come to their aid without question. And we'll see that NATO complemented the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan as it challenged Soviet expansion. However, it's going to place the USSR and the United States even closer to open conflict. And as you would expect, Stalin would respond. On May 14th of 1955, as an answer to the formation of NATO, the USSR created the Warsaw Pact. It was named for the city in which the pact was agreed upon and signed, which was Warsaw, Poland, after West Germany was integrated into NATO in 1955. Like NATO, it was a collective defense treaty among the Soviet Union and 7 other Soviet satellite states, which included Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Romania. Formerly known as the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance, the pact in reality gave Stalin the ability to maintain more direct control over all military forces in Central and Eastern Europe in the name of national defense. Now, this is despite the fact that he was controlling not only Soviet troops, but also the troops of the countries that were considered his satellites. Unfortunately for the United States, it lost its place of supremacy on August of 1949 when the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, thus opening a nuclear arms race with the United States. By 1953, a year after the United States had developed theirs, the USSR developed their hydrogen bomb, raising the stakes of the Cold War. The world itself was now caught between two distinct superpowers, each with conflicting ideologies, a desire for expansion, and the possession of powerful nuclear weapons. We need to note that the success of the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons program came from the information and material obtained through their spies in the United States, both during and after the Manhattan Project. And it was this fact that led many U.S. officials to advocate for increased internal surveillance of American citizens, thus risking the impediment on Americans' civil liberties. Here we have the short movie Duck and Cover, which was a civil service production instructing kids and adults what to do in case of a nuclear attack. I would like you to watch this film, which you can find in Section 2's additional materials. And while you watch this film, I would like you to remember the pictures of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and ask yourself, does this film truly describe the horrors of a nuclear attack? And does it create the illusion that nuclear war can be survived? More so than what was seen in the first two world wars, fear seemed to take hold of many Americans. This heightened anxiety was in part due to the fact that the two opposing world powers now had nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them over long ranges, thus ending the protection of the ocean barriers. The increased fear also came from those within government who either genuinely feared or sought to use the tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States to boost their careers. Men like Attorney General Howard McGrath warned in 1949 that communists are everywhere in factories, offices, butcher shops, in street corners, in private businesses, plotting to destroy the liberties of every citizen. This was accompanied by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who warned against the diabolic machinations of sinister figures engaged in un American activities. And what would be the second Red Scare? We will see that this fear gripped American society on every level as it embodied in widespread fear of communist infiltration in American institutions and society, thus leading to investigations that led to blacklisting of individuals linked to often unfounded accusations of disloyalty against the United States. Along those lines, Truman will implement Executive Order 9835, also known as the Loyalty Order. This established the first general loyalty program in the history of the United States, and it was designed to root out communist influence in the federal government. Individuals would be dismissed if reasonable grounds were established to believe that they were disloyal. This might include memberships in specific organizations linked to communism. President Truman basically aimed to rally public opinion behind his Cold War policies by conducting investigations under his authority to root out this possible communist infiltration. A Central Loyalty Review Board, established within the Civil Service Commission, reviewed cases and offered advisory recommendations on dismissals, which opened the door to multiple violations of Americans and the Bill of Rights. Executive Order 9835 is widely seen as a key element of this second Red Scare, as the order was partially a response to political pressure from the Republican Party, which accused the Truman administration of being too soft on communism. The Attorney General published a list of potentially subversive organizations, though many of these groups had long been disbanded. Despite a person's position at the time of the investigations, their past memberships might negate their more recent accomplishments or standing in support of the United States. Congress will pass a wide range of restrictions concerning alleged subversions and push legislation that stigmatized communists and barred them and what they linked homosexuals to the Communist Party from immigrating into the country. We'll see that the second Red Scare created a new and increased form of discrimination fueled by the fear that swept throughout the nation. During this period, we'll also see the creation of the organization known as the House of Un-American Activities Committee, which investigated suspected communist influence throughout the United States. It generally targeted Hollywood and their celebrities, members of the American elite, college professors, wealthy liberals, though we will note that wealthy conservative individuals were not investigated. A junior congressman by the name of Richard Nixon gained support through his attacks on communism and possible communists within the United States. The committee gained support after Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed as Soviet spies, despite worldwide protests. They were accused of providing critical technical and scientific information in relation to the U.S. atomic program to the Soviet Union. Historically, it will be the junior Senator Joseph McCarthy from Wisconsin who would serve as the metaphor of the period. This low-level politician with very little support and for the most part looking to lose the next election, gained the attention of Americans when he declared that 205 communists worked within the State Department. From that point on, he used the fears of the American public to increase his power within the country. Joined by Congressman Richard Nixon, the two increased government investigations into possible communist infiltration. The movement he created, McCarthyism, attacked women's organizations, civil rights groups, universities, and again, homosexuals who were believed to be leaders within the perceived communist plots. Though the two lacked the evidence to support their claims, they still struck a chord with many fearful Americans. Nixon and McCarthy drove a wedge between the political left and right, creating a with us or against us mentality on both sides, which only grew worse over the decades. In this political cartoon of the period, we see many questioning the second Red Scare. People started to see that the fear created by the political leaders concerning the proposed, perceived communist infiltration and influence throughout the country and the world was beginning to create an even scarier problem for Americans. This was because to protect the American way, many of these individuals that were advocating for the Red Scare and a strong response to it called for the scaling back of America's civil liberties. In the attempt to limit the stated but yet unproven Soviet threat within the country, these Red Scare advocates sought to restrict rights of Americans. But by doing so, they themselves were creating a Stalin-like state here in the United States. Now, that being said, we need to keep in mind that the Soviet Union maintained a distinct advantage over the United States when it came to gathering intelligence. The poor state of the Soviet society rendered bribes and payments to key people who could provide critical information to the United States as ineffective. Thus, the U.S. was forced to resort to aircraft and electronic surveillance, which occasionally promised future riches for potential intelligence assets, but was no near as successful as using bribes and blackmails in order to gain intelligence from key individuals. Now, for the Soviet intelligence apparatus, the United States offered numerous opportunities for gathering critical information. Because here in the United States, bribes, payments, and gifts were not really evident in the successful American economic and social conditions. Additionally, the existence of the open press only enhanced the ability of the Soviet Union to gather needed intelligence of not only the United States but other Western nations. Continuing the McCarthy metaphor, we will see that the American television both lifted McCarthy's popularity and later caused his rapid downfall. Eventually, McCarthy and those like him pushed their crusade too far and lost the support of many of the American population. For McCarthy, His place of power was lost when he went on national TV and appeared deranged while making wild charges of communist infiltration within the United States Army. In the wake of the resulting government investigations and committee hearings, he began to lose key allies, including Richard Nixon. In the end, McCarthy lost all his earlier supporters and was censured by Congress in 1954. That same year, he lost his re-election bid and left the federal government a defeated and broken man. 3 years later, he died from alcohol abuse, which had reportedly destroyed his liver. However, unlike McCarthy, Richard Nixon continued to gain greater attention when he accused a Truman advisor, Albert Hiss, of being a Russian spy. Despite Nixon's efforts, Hiss was only convicted of perjury, but his association with Truman and the accusations leveled by Nixon tarnished the Truman administration and the Democratic Party as a whole. The United States achieved its greatest success in Asia through its actions and policies towards Japan. After Japan's defeat, the United States occupied the nation with an Army General Douglas MacArthur serving as the first U.S. military governor. The U.S. established a parliamentary government, but as stated earlier, continued the presence of the emperor. A host of reforms brought unprecedented democracy to the country. Through his success in Japan, the so-called hero of World War II, Douglas MacArthur, gained increased popularity in the United States. Though many ignored his questionable actions that led to the fall of the Philippines to the Japanese, which almost resulted in his court-martial under FDR. It should be noted that his family's long history protected him from many of his failings and questionable acts throughout his career. And the reason why I bring this up is because we will see how this hero of World War II will come very close to creating the next World War through the use of nuclear weapons. Unfortunately for the U.S., in 1948, its favorable position in Asia ended when Mao Zedong and his communist revolution overthrew the corrupt but pro-American government. Following in the path of his ally Stalin, Mao's revolution left millions dead or jailed in his purge of possible opposition. Eventually, his actions and their deadly aftermath overshadowed the number of deaths associated with both Stalin and Hitler combined. Mao quickly cut off all ties with the United States, leaving the Truman administration bearing the responsibility for the loss of China as a key Asian ally. It should be noted, though, that both FDR and Truman made grave mistakes by failing to give Asia the attention it required. With the loss of China, the administration's containment policy appeared to be failing as the threat of communism seemed to be expanding throughout the world. This was especially concerning because the largest countries in the world, the Soviet Union and China, were now under the communist ideology. With the spread of communism, Truman sought to prevent the Soviet Union's influence from spreading further worldwide. As French control over the country of Vietnam declined in the face of communist rebels supported by the USSR, Truman will increase American assistance to the French and their Vietnamese allies. Despite the fact that Vietnam failed to have any strategic value for the United States, or for that matter, the Western nations, Truman viewed the possible fall of Vietnam to the communist rebels as a further black mark on his already shaky political legacy. Though the assistance would be minimal, it was later expanded under 3 successive presidents, as each looked to avoid a black mark of their own in their own personal presidential legacies. After World War II, in a situation that resembled Germany, the former country of Korea was occupied in the northern region by the Soviet Union, while the United States occupied Korea's southern region. The line of separation between the two countries in Korea ran along the 38th parallel. By 1948, the two separate countries maintained their own governments. These governments were formed under the influence of the two benefactors, the United States and the Soviet Union. Now we need to keep in mind that both of these governments claimed to be the legitimate government of Korea, as neither side accepted the border as being permanent. Now this conflict escalated into war on June 25th of 1950 when North Korean forces supported by the Soviet Union and China invaded South Korea. Within the first 2 months, South Korean forces were on the point of defeat as North Korea controlled nearly 90% of the country. Fearing the fall of South Korea, the United States deployed troops from Japan to secure the last section under South Korean control. We'll find that Truman would be criticized by Congress for bypassing their authority when he deployed these troops. And this would only further the conflict between himself and Congress. On June 27th, the UN Security Council dispatched military forces to Korea to assist the United States in ending the invasion. Ultimately, the United States provided 88% of the UN military's personnel that would be deployed into Korea. In September of 1950, the new Supreme Commander, Douglas MacArthur, launched an amphibious counteroffensive into the city of Incheon, which cut off the North Korean attackers and forced them to retreat back into the north. However, with the success of the UN US-led forces, MacArthur advocated a push into North Korea to ultimately defeat the communist forces and unite Korea under democracy. Though Truman worried China might see the invasion as a hostile act and intervene, MacArthur assured Truman that the chances of a Chinese intervention were slim, if not non-existent. By November of 1950, North Korea was nearly under the control of the US-led UN forces. Unfortunately, as Truman had worried, China feared it might lose a key buffer zone that protected it from Western interference, and in turn sent hundreds of thousands of troops into North Korea to drive the UN forces back to South Korea. As the UN forces lost ground to the Chinese, Douglas MacArthur informed the press that he wanted to use nuclear weapons against the Chinese forces. When Truman countered the general, a very public argument began to develop between the two men. When President Truman ordered his general back to the United States for a meeting, MacArthur refused to meet with Truman and forced Truman to come to him in the Pacific. It was at this point, fearing that MacArthur had lost all concept of the chain of command, that Truman removed MacArthur from that command. The Korean War and his discord with the famous general were the final nails in Truman's political coffin. Thus, he would not run for re-election. Famed former General Dwight D. Eisenhower won the Republican nomination for president on a pledge to go to Korea to end the war. Eisenhower's running mate, Richard Nixon, waged a relentless attack on the Democrats and chipped away at their national support. In his campaign, Eisenhower saw communism as the focus of his foreign policy and promised a new world or Cold War strategy that would rely on nuclear weapons. He also suggested the use of the CIA for covert actions to forestall an all-out nuclear conflict. It is because of this and the poor turnout of Democrats that Eisenhower will win the presidential election while his Republican Party gain control over Congress. In the final 2 years of the Korean conflict, we see that the war became one of attrition, with the front line stalling along the 38th parallel. With the United Nations acceptance of an armistice, the Korean Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, was created along the 38th parallel. On June 27th of 1953, the armistice agreement ended the fighting, but we'll find that no peace treaty was ever signed. This meant, and still means, that the two Koreas and the United States were and are technically still at war. The war expanded from the Western nations' containment policy far beyond Europe, requiring far more resources and money than had been anticipated. The lackluster end of the Korean War left many Americans disillusioned with the promise of a series of easy victories against communism, which only added to the American fear of communist expansion. And we need to keep in mind, too, that the fact that the United States military did not win this conflict and actually at various points found themselves on the retreat caused a lot of Americans to now begin second guessing the power and capability of the United States military. Dwight Eisenhower will modify the former containment concept with his personal domino theory. It would have a significant effect upon the United States' foreign policy between the 1950s and the 1980s. Now, this theory speculated that if one country in a region came under communist influence, the surrounding countries would follow in a domino effect. Successive American administrations used this domino theory during the Cold War in order to justify their interventions into countries deemed vulnerable to communist takeovers. This encouraged a shift towards an expanded U.S. military and a focus on nuclear weapons systems. The domino theory was a key factor in Eisenhower's decision to become heavily involved in Vietnam, as he feared that if South Vietnam fell to communism, it would trigger a cascade of communist victories throughout Southeast Asia. In 1953, the French military suffered a massive defeat that forced their complete withdrawal from Vietnam. As France abandoned the region, it split Vietnam into two parts, reminiscent of Germany and Korea's division. North Vietnam became a communist nation led by a former U.S. ally, Ho Chi Minh, while the South section of Vietnam maintained the former democratic government led by Ngo Dinh Diem. And we'll find that by 1955, Eisenhower began sending even increased amounts of financial support, in addition to military advisors and military equipment to South Vietnam in order to assist the government in its defense from communist infiltration. We're also going to see that a significant problem for the U.S. was the fact that Ngo Dinh Diem was perceived as a corrupt leader with minimal support from the South Vietnamese population. And furthermore, kind of alluding to the importance of historians, the U.S. severely miscalculated the relationship between China and Vietnam when it ignored the historical narrative of the two countries, thus creating a problem that truly did not exist. With all that was going on with the Cold War, under Eisenhower, political and military leaders re examined the role of the U.S. military in this expanding Cold War. The majority viewed war as no longer to be fought by troops, but instead, during this period of the nuclear age, the troops would only be needed to secure land after a nuclear exchange. They saw high performance aircraft, ships, rockets that were capable of carrying nuclear weapons as the next step in the modern warfare. Under these new philosophies, the military services actively competed with each other to survive the fallout from this new focus. In the end, we'll find that the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Air Force became the primary recipients of funding for this new military, as missile technology, strategic bombers, nuclear submarines, and aircraft carriers dominated the American strategic doctrine. For the Army and the Marine Corps, they will see their roles significantly marginalized as they were seen as supporting branches to the Navy and the Air Force. As the United States sought to build its new military forces, Eisenhower encouraged the creation of a military industrial complex. This represented an informal alliance between the nation's military and defense industry, creating a multi-billion-dollar business dependent on the status of America's foreign affairs. we'll find that politicians who enabled or profited from the military industrial complex tended to push agendas that favored increased military spending, benefiting both themselves and their constituents. And it should also be noted that many of these politicians would be far more aggressive within their foreign policies, especially if it required the use of the military. Through Operation Paperclip, the U.S. captured key material and scientists related to Germany's V-1 and V-2 rockets in the attempt to replicate and later surpass Germany's Wonder weapons. The Germans' World War II V-1 and V-2 rockets, though limited in their success, promised the ability to deliver various ordnances across the oceans that once protected nations. With the development of nuclear weapons, the potential of these missiles and rockets offered increased power to a country's arsenal. Both the US and USSR sought to build a rocket capable of launching their nuclear and thermonuclear warheads over the ocean and into space. Because once they reached space, the descent of a nuclear weapon would be nearly impossible to stop as it made its way into the offending country, making it the perfect weapon. Using the same process as the United States, but with some earlier successes, the Soviet Union was able to build a rocket capable of lifting a large payload. In a demonstration of their rocket, on October 4th of 1957, the USSR launched the first satellite into low elliptical Earth orbit. Sputnik was visible for all around the world to see, and its radio signal was easily detectable by anybody with an amateur radio. This accomplishment meant that the USSR was far closer to completing a fully functional intercontinental thermonuclear missile, sending new fears throughout the United States and NATO countries. The surprise success of the Soviet Union triggered what became known as the space race between the United States and the USSR. Over the following decades, the space race put a civilian and scientific face on what was overwhelmingly, though, a military competition. As a response to Sputnik, President Dwight D. Eisenhower established the first official American space agency in 1958. Publicized as a peaceful civilian program to counter the Soviets' military focus, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, was predominantly dominated by the military personnel and technology. Though it officially encouraged peaceful applications of space science, it unofficially and more accurately sought to counter the Soviets' dominance in space. Although the United States had two types of rockets capable of launching payloads into space, only one remained functional. The first rocket was seen as the best way to show that the US was interested in peaceful scientific missions into space, but unfortunately for the United States, it was far from being ready. This forced the United States to turn to the United States Army Redstone rocket. This was designed by the former Nazi scientist Wernher von Braun. Now, von Braun's rocket provided the American response to Sputnik when on January 31st of 1958, the U.S. launched Explorer 1, where it remained in orbit until 1970. Now, this Explorer project would eventually send numerous other Explorer series scientific spacecraft into Earth orbit. Though, despite its larger economy and wide range of scientific research, we're going to find that the United States remained behind the USSR in space operations for several more years. And this is only going to further drive American fears of Soviet global dominance. To add insult to injury to the United States, the U.S. policy of containment was once again shown to be flawed as the Soviet influence reached the island of Cuba, as a revolution brought Fidel Castro to power in 1959. This caused thousands of Cubans to flee their island in hopes of gaining freedom in the United States. After years of poor alliances with questionable leaders, the United States appeared to be losing influence throughout Latin America. More significantly, the fall of Cuba to a communist government meant that only 90 miles off the coast of Florida was a possible threat to American security. As the 1950s came to a close, the United States seemed to be losing its grip on the world socially, diplomatically, and militarily. In closing, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union began with the success of American and NATO responses to Stalin's attempt to isolate Berlin. Thereafter, the Soviet Union gradually gained numerous successes through the spread of communism into Europe and Asia. And again, remember, 90 miles off the coast of America in Cuba. Remember that the idea of the Cold War was for each country to use indirect actions in order to hinder the other's attempt to expand its influence. With that in mind, the United States' direct participation and failure to unite the two Koreas displayed not only its failed attempt to contain communism, but brought the capabilities of the U.S. military into question. Unfortunately, this would not be the last time the United States experienced such doubts. Despite the Soviet Union's public successes, the Communist Party, though, hides a critical problem. As the Long Telegram predicted, the USSR could not support its expanding military and space program with its flawed economic model. And though a significant thorn in the US and NATO's side, as George Kennan stated, even at this point, the USSR was starting to show signs of falling apart internally.